place is located in the Golan Heights in southwestern Syria. 3 Centurion main battle tanks quietly infiltrated the enemy formation, exploiting weaknesses in the opponent's tactics to launch a fierce attack, ultimately achieving a glorious victory with a score of 100-0, shocking the world. This event was even recorded in the textbooks of military academies around the world and became a mandatory subject. This is the famous Battle of the Valley of Tears during the Fourth Middle East War. After the Six-Day War broke out in June 1967, Israel quickly occupied Syria's Golan Heights and Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. In retaliation, Syria and Egypt, with the support of the Soviet Union, formed a large-scale coalition force. They decided to launch a full-scale attack on Israel on October 6, 1973, during the Yom Kippur holiday. At that time, at the Hermon Mountain outpost on the Golan Heights, saw an intelligence officer named Avinoam accidentally intercepted a dangerous signal. Syria was urgently evacuating border residents. This very likely signaled an impending war. However, when he reported this news to the captain, he was harshly rebuked. It turned out that similar situations had occurred many times before, but in the end, nothing happened. It wasn't until the next day that all the intelligence personnel simultaneously heard the touchy signal. While everyone was still bewildered, Avinoam, who was fluent in Arabic, immediately realized. He recognized this as the code name for the war that Syria was about to launch. Therefore, he immediately reported this information to the commander. However, before they could inform the tank camp at the foot of the mountain, the Syrian army had already begun their attack. At this time, the soldiers in the tank camp were joyfully bathing, preparing to celebrate the important Yom Kippur, completely unaware that war was about to break out. Suddenly, Syrian fighter jets flew over the camp. The surprise attack left the tank soldiers unable to react in time. In a panic, they hurriedly climbed into the 3 Centurion tanks parked next to the camp and urgently drove away from the camp. However, when they reached the border, not far away, a terrifying scene unfolded before their eyes. Dozens of Syrian army tanks were rapidly advancing towards them. This caused the mood of all the tank soldiers to become extremely tense. They hurriedly contacted headquarters for reinforcements, but received the response that they must stop the enemy tanks, and were also informed that there were no other Israeli military units nearby. This meant they would have to face the most difficult situation, which was fighting alone. In a desperate situation, they maneuvered their scarce 3 Centurion tanks, skillfully using a slope, as cover to proactively attack the Syrian forces 2,000 meters away. They locked onto the lead enemy tank as their target. The first shell hit the target accurately, which made the Israeli tank crew extremely excited. From their elevated position, the Centurions were like snipers, successively hitting the turret tops of the Syrian tanks. With the powerful 150mm rifled gun, firing at a rate of 6 to 10 rounds per minute, they continuously destroyed many of the enemy's T-55 tanks. The Syrian army drove their tanks with the hatches closed, completely unable to clearly observe the surrounding situation, while the Israeli commanders leaned out of the turrets, calmly directing the battle. Even in a situation of 3 against 100, they fought more fiercely, until the Syrian army finally realized their presence and began to counterattack fiercely. The 3 Centurion tanks maximized the advantage of the slope, coordinating closely with each other to provide alternating covering fire. Once a tank finished firing its rounds, it quickly retreated to reload. Then the tank that had reloaded would advance to continue firing. Thanks to excellent coordination tactics and equipment performance, they gained absolute superiority in the battle. The initial fear also gradually dissipated. The 3 Centurion main battle tanks defeated the Syrian army, achieving a glorious victory by destroying 40 Syrian tanks without sustaining any damage. Shortly thereafter, they received new orders from headquarters to immediately advance towards the Henionim axis to continue fighting. After the fierce battle, the Centurions that had just won their first battle continued their efforts to advance towards the objective. The towering smoke and fire on the battlefield constantly reminded them that danger lurked everywhere. Suddenly, 3 T-55 main battle tanks of the Syrian army charged in from the flank. The lead tank, bearing the brunt of the fierce attack, was directly hit. The tank driver was severely shaken and lost consciousness. The observer saw 3 tanks ahead on the right advancing towards them. The second tank completed the reloading process. The turret turned towards the target at maximum speed, but was obstructed by the first tank, which was immobilized. The third tank quickly reacted by moving to the left of the second tank. As a shell whistled through the air, the T-55 that was hit immediately burst into fierce flames. Amidst the calls from his comrades, the driver of the first tank finally regained consciousness. As soon as he regained awareness, he immediately maneuvered the tank to reverse. The second tank regained its line of sight, promptly fired, and once again hit the target. At this point, the Syrian army had only one tank left trying to resist. The tank crew on the turret immediately used the machine gun to fire relentlessly for harassment. The second tank quickly reloaded, aimed and fired once more. This time, fortune smiled again, sealing another victory. Lieutenant Team Leader Aviram hurriedly climbed into the first tank to check on the condition of the unconscious comrade. After confirming there were no issues, he ordered to continue moving out. Everyone was immersed in the joy of victory. No one expected that danger was silently approaching. Suddenly, a precise bullet hit Aviram's head, a fatal shot that took his life forever. It turned out that the Syrian army had ambushed anti-tank soldiers in the bushes opposite. Witnessing his closest friend die tragically before his eyes, his comrade Caspi was in extreme anguish, immediately jumping off the tank, staggering forward to check the situation. However, the moment he touched the ground, a missile fired by the Syrian army hit his tank. The comrades inside, who couldn't climb out in time, were blown into the air by the shockwave of the explosion. The continuous attacks from the enemy drove him completely insane. He rushed towards the second tank amidst the rain of bombs and bullets, grabbed the machine gun and fired relentlessly at the enemy. At the same time, he ordered his comrades to drive the tank into the bushes to crush the anti-tank soldiers hiding inside. Under Caspi's frenzied and fierce attack, the Syrian troops hiding in the bushes were completely unable to resist. After the battle ended, both tanks had completely run out of ammunition. The headquarters ordered them to continue with the original plan to the Henayonim axis for reinforcement. This order left the tank soldier Makro very confused. With the current situation of having no ammunition, going to the center of the battlefield was akin to going to their deaths. However, Caspi had a completely different thought. His mind was filled with the scene of Aviram's tragic sacrifice. The flames of revenge had consumed his reason. As the highest-ranking officer in the group, he completely ignored everyone's advice. Didn't care whether the tank had ammunition or not, and was determined to follow the order to advance to the front line to avenge Aviram. Everyone's emotions were extremely confused at this moment, but for soldiers, obeying orders is the top duty. Despite being filled with worry and anxiety, they continued to operate the remaining two tanks and set out to carry out the mission. By the roadside, several kilometers away from the tank battlefield, tank soldier Menachi, due to personal reasons, was unable to join the fight in time. Fortunately, he met the French writer Many on the road, who was looking for his son, who had lost contact. So the two became friends and traveled together. They also met a girl named Daphne who was seeking her boyfriend near the command post. After a difficult journey, they still couldn't find the people they were looking for and went to the command post to ask for help. Unexpectedly, the command post was extremely busy and completely ignored them. At the same time, the tank team on their way to the target encountered an unexpected situation. Caspi noticed an armored transport vehicle quickly approaching from the front. Tank number 2 immediately loaded the only remaining shell and carefully asked the command center if they could attack. The command center ordered them to conserve ammunition. Facing the armored vehicle that was getting closer, Caspi lost control again, and without saying a word, immediately fired a barrage at it. However, what surprised everyone was that the soldiers who emerged from the armored vehicle were actually from the Israeli Defense Forces. His comrades immediately called for Caspi to stop shooting, but he was so enraged that he didn't listen at all and continued to fire wildly. When everything calmed down, some of the tank soldiers immediately got out to check the situation. Inside the armored vehicle, only one soldier survived. Fortunately, that person was Yoni, Meni's son, but he was so terrified that he was in a daze. Witnessing the tragedy he had caused, Caspi was filled with regret. However, the only thing he could do now was to arrange the fallen Israeli soldiers neatly, trying to make them lie a bit more comfortably. After the incident of accidentally killing his comrades, the other tank soldiers began to doubt Caspi, who held the highest rank. Recalling the scene of Caspi firing wildly, everyone agreed that his mental state was unstable and he could no longer lead his comrades forward. But at this moment, Caspi was the one with the highest rank. Facing the doubts, he used a tough attitude to order his comrades to continue driving the tanks towards the Mahane Yahmim axis. The soldiers, though very reluctant, could only obey the orders. The two tanks had gone through fierce battles and soon ran out of ammunition and supplies. Not long after, they arrived at the lower part of the 87th Battalion's battlefield. Tank number 2 was responsible for going to the mountain position to check if there were any artillery shells left, while tank number 1 was responsible for staying and holding the lower position. At this moment, they suddenly discovered 3 main battle tanks of the Syrian army advancing towards them. The tank soldiers had only 1 artillery shell left and they immediately panicked. But in this situation, Caspi still ordered everyone to take up arms and prepare for battle. Everyone felt he was too reckless and decided not to follow his orders anymore. Seeing the enemy tanks advancing step by step in a moment of crisis, the driver lowered the gun barrel and climbed out of the tank, placing the bodies of the fallen comrades in front of the tank. Then, he spread a blanket under the turret and set it on fire, making the tank look as if it had been destroyed. The soldiers hiding inside the tank did not dare to make a sound. Unexpectedly, this clever trick actually fooled the Syrian army. After the danger had passed, the tank that went to search for ammunition also returned. They did not find any ammunition and the tank was destroyed. After many difficulties, they reached position 87, but found the situation there was even worse. The entire position had only 4 people left who were still holding on. The ammo was also nearly depleted, and just a few more rounds of fighting could destroy the position. Night after night, Syrian army airstrikes continuously hit, with the sound of bombs shaking the sky. The tank unit also suffered heavy casualties in the bombings. Even the Centurion tank, which had achieved great feats, was destroyed. Seeing their wounded comrades in pain beside them, the remaining soldiers couldn't help but worry, yet they were powerless. They had no way to treat so many wounded, and could only call the forward command post to request support for transporting the injured. Otherwise, they would all die here. Unexpectedly, the response they received was to continue waiting, and then the call was abruptly ended. In fact, many places along the Israeli border were under attack, and the National Defense Forces were stretched to their limits, so there was no way to send personnel to assist. Looking down the mountain, Syria's powerful armored brigade was advancing deep into Israel. The soldiers at position 87 could only fortify their defenses and silently pray in their hearts, hoping to survive a few more days on the battlefield. In this atmosphere of pressure and despair, a fighter jet suddenly flew by at low altitude. The soldiers on the ground had been tormented by the flames of war for a long time. Their nerves stretched to the limit. Instinctively, they picked up their submachine guns and fired wildly. Only after a while did they realize it was their own military aircraft. Just when everyone thought the situation had changed and cheered with joy, unexpectedly, the next second, a missile directly extinguished their hope. The fighter jet was shot down by an enemy missile in the air. Everyone grabbed their binoculars to look up, realizing that the pilot had managed to parachute out. Caspi and the others rushed over to rescue, but they discovered that the pilot had been captured by the Syrian team. Recalling comrades who had died in front of them, this time they decided that no matter what, they had to rescue the pilot. So the 4 of them immediately chose to flank from both the left and right to rescue the pilot. Gunfire erupted. 1 Syrian soldier was successfully eliminated, and the remaining 2 enemies immediately counterattacked. After a fierce battle, they finally succeeded in rescuing the pilot. Who would have thought that the pilot would deliver disheartening news? The Golan Heights had completely fallen. The Sinai Peninsula was also about to be occupied by the Egyptian army. Even more despairingly, the command center had no countermeasures. Even the position 87 they were at was one of the units abandoned by the command center. After speaking, the pilot vomited blood profusely due to severe internal injuries that were beyond saving, and he quickly perished. Meanwhile, at the command center, everyone was anxiously awaiting news about the pilots. We need to understand that at that time, pilots capable of flying modern fighter jets were more valuable than gold. Even if the aircraft was damaged, the first mission was always to save the pilot. So, the 87th Battlefield was immediately connected to the command center. They used the rescue of the pilot to ask for help. Upon hearing, the headquarters responded to send a vehicle and ensure everyone's safe return. Not long after, the rescue vehicle finally arrived, but unexpectedly, it was only a single jeep. The rescue team reached the top of the hill and discovered the pilot had perished. He had already died when the call was made. However, now is not the time to assign blame. With the battlefield in need of personnel, they could only bring back the pilot and the tank soldiers. As for the regular infantry, they could only remain in their positions to observe, providing guidance for the Israeli units arriving later. They were cannon fodder. However, a tank soldier named Alec was upright. He didn't want to abandon his comrades, so he decided to stay and face life or death alongside the infantry. Another tank soldier thought he was very naive, believing that finding a new tank would allow them to defeat more enemies. Who would have thought that Alex's spirit would inspire others? Cosby also decided to stay with him. In the end, only 2 people left. But the battlefield is not a place where mere enthusiasm is enough, as they were facing 3,000 Syrian soldiers and 300 armored tanks attacking. They saw that the Syrian army was assembling and quickly advancing towards them. The current situation gave them 2 choices. The first was to hold the Uzi submachine gun and resolutely defend their position. But this choice was akin to using eggs to hit rocks. The second choice was to scatter bodies at different positions and call the command center to directly use artillery to support position 87. At that point, everyone would hide in the bunkers, which could delay the Syrian army's attack. Not long after, the artillery began bombarding the position. Everyone followed the plan and hid in the bunkers. Cosby was outside observing the shelling situation, but due to the long distance, the shelling was not well controlled, and Cosby was affected by the blast wave of the explosion. When everyone rushed out to rescue him, his ears had temporarily lost hearing. Not long after, the artillery ceased firing on the position. The Syrian army also did not continue to advance. At this point, the Golan Heights had been shattered, and the soldiers on position 87 seemed to be forgotten. Malachi's comrades directed the signal receiver and continuously called for help. Daphne at the command post happened to hear the distress signal. Fortunately, she unexpectedly learned that Manny's son, Johnny, was still alive and currently at position 87, awaiting rescue. So she immediately reported this news to Manny. Confirming that his son was safe, Manny's anxious heart finally eased. Taking advantage of a moment when no one was paying attention, he drove the command post's vehicle, preparing to personally rescue his son. 20 kilometers from the target location, he encountered a reserve army with 3 tanks. Since the Centurion tanks were not equipped with night vision, the squad agreed to accompany Manny to position 87 the following day. Meanwhile, the soldiers at position 87 were facing the threat of annihilation because the Syrian army had arrived outside the bunker. Everyone was tense, gripping their weapons tightly, staring intently at the entrance. Ty had already pulled the pin on a grenade, ready to die alongside the Syrian soldiers preparing to storm in. However, the Syrian army did not give them this opportunity. The enemy first threw in a grenade to probe. Outside, thousands of Syrian army soldiers shouted, calling for those in the bunker to surrender, or else they would use bombs to annihilate them all. Faced with the relentless siege by the Syrian army, Alex finally decided to take the initiative to surrender himself. Just as the enemy was about to kill him, a Syrian soldier suddenly said he was the commanding captain of the Air Force, intending to capture him for a reward. Alex told the Syrian army that everyone inside was already dead, hoping to perhaps gain a sliver of hope for survival for everyone. But before leaving, the Syrian army still threw 2 grenades into the bunker. Early the next morning, when Manny and the tank soldiers arrived at position 87, the bodies from the shelling outside horrified them. Fortunately, most of the people in the bunker survived, and the soldiers still held tightly to the grenades with the pins pulled. Manny also successfully found his son here. Not long after, all the soldiers at position 87 were rescued back to headquarters. This was the 3rd day since the full-scale war broke out. The Syrian army had broken through the anti-tank defense line. They had a large armored force outside Queen Najjar. The southern part of the Golan Heights was also about to be occupied by the Syrian army. The soldiers on the battlefield had been fighting for 3 days. If the enemy advanced to the west and south, Israel would lose its armored reserves. But the headquarters no longer had the forces to reinforce the Golan Heights. The wounded soldiers lying in bed were their only remaining force. Therefore, the command decided to deploy all 11 remaining tanks into battle. Veteran Manny, who once drove the Hellman tank, decided to return to the battlefield with his injured son. Manny returned to his old position, taking on the role of tank commander. As for his son Johnny, who had no experience at all, he temporarily took on the role of loader. Thus, the father and son, along with 2 other tank soldiers, formed a combat unit. They drove the Centurion tank to the center of the Golan Heights. At this time, the entire valley was flooded with the armored forces of the Syrian army. Moreover, they had crossed the anti-tank line and were about to cross the midline. However, the tank crew did not retreat. The Centurion slowly poked its head out from the slope. Then they targeted a Syrian T-62 main battle tank. Johnny, who had just been exposed to the tank, was dizzy from the shock, then slowly picked up the shell to reload. Such unskilled handling made everyone extremely worried. The Syrian tank took the opportunity to launch a counter-attack, but due to its advantageous position, the Centurion was not significantly affected. At the same time, Johnny finally finished loading the shell. They set another enemy T-55 tank on fire. They realized that they couldn't stop more than 100 tanks like this, so they decided to make an emergency retreat. However, the command post ordered them to hold their ground to block the advance of the Syrian army. The tank crew had no choice but to accept the order and return to their uphill position. The gunner, with excellent skills, hit the target with every shot. As each Syrian tank was destroyed by them, Johnny's reloading speed also began to increase, which made him feel extremely excited. At this moment, a large number of T-62 tanks appeared ahead on the right, so the tank crew once again requested to withdraw from the battlefield. However, the commander still ordered them to persist in holding the slope to ensure the central defense line remained secure, buying time for the forces on both flanks. The tank soldiers, having received the order, had no choice but to fight to the death. They changed their combat positions again to continue steadfastly defending. At some point, the Centurion tank had fired all 64 of its shells. Unexpectedly, in this situation, the command post still did not allow retreat. Even if they had to use machine guns, they had to stop the enemy. When everyone was out of options, the tank driver Meleki suddenly remembered the words of a previous instructor. It was that the Syrian tanks had good night vision equipment, but they were taught a wrong skill. That is, to keep the hatch closed while fighting. This would narrow their field of view. The observation distance was very limited, essentially leaving them unaware of the situation around the tank. In contrast, the Israeli army was commanded from outside the tank, so Meleki made an extremely bold decision. He decided to return to resupply ammunition, then blend into the enemy tank group for close combat. This way, they might be able to defeat the Syrian tank corps. So the tank team immediately returned to the supply camp. At that moment, a few more tanks arrived to gather. Malachi adjusted his plan, thinking that no matter how they fought, they would die anyway. Taking a risk might still offer a glimmer of hope for survival. They resupplied ammunition and continued on their way. Since they had previously halted the enemy tank attack, it allowed the Israeli command headquarters to breathe a sigh of relief. Other front lines also gradually began to counterattack. The entire situation required their 6 tanks to hold out for as long as possible. They had to wait until the Air Force finished off the Egyptian Air Force, then bombers would be sent to provide support. This offered the tank soldiers hope for survival, as a tank battle with few allies and enemies was about to erupt. Under Malachi's orders, 6 centurions quickly charged into the enemy tank formation from 2 directions. As expected, they were not detected. The T-62 tanks, with their limited visibility, were focused only on moving forward and were soon hit. The centurions mingled within the enemy forces, moving around and choosing the right moment to engage in close-range destruction. The Syrian tanks, like headless flies, ran chaotically, being toyed with by the Israeli tank team. Seeing the dire situation, the Syrian tank soldiers abandoned their vehicles and fled. As a result, they were all gunned down by Malachi with a machine gun. By the time the Syrian army reacted and began to counterattack, their vision was obstructed, and their response capability was much slower compared to Malachi, who was standing on the cabin roof. After several attacks, the bewildered enemy tank formation was shattered by 6 centurions. Afterwards, 2 main battle tanks of Syria attempted to flee the battlefield. The centurion, driven by many, immediately pursued and destroyed 1 tank. However, the centurion suddenly encountered a clutch problem and could not continue the chase. They could only helplessly watch as the other tank escaped. This made Malachi extremely angry. Suddenly, a shell hit them, leaving them stunned. Malachi immediately grabbed a grenade, jumped off the tank, and charged towards the T-62 not far away. However, just as he climbed onto the tank to prepare for a counterattack, another shell hit the centurion. Malachi shouted, opened the enemy tank's cabin door, knifed through the grenade inside, and used his body to block the door, preventing them from escaping. After realizing the explosion had occurred, he returned to the centurion to rescue his comrades. Finally, through Malachi's tireless efforts, all the tank crew inside were rescued. Unfortunately, Manny's son could not be saved due to the severity of his injuries. The desperate father could only try to compress his son's chest, hoping he would open his eyes once more. A few bullets fired from not far away. Malachi grabbed a submachine gun and returned fire. Then, an enemy soldier opposite raised his hands in surrender. However, the tank crew member Mako was furious. He disregarded his teammates' attempts to stop him, went up and beat the Syrian soldier to death. This was a classic battle with significant enemy advantages. After 5 weeks of fierce fighting, Israel's defensive battle on the northern front against the Syrian army came to an end. In the following days, the Israeli army advanced deep into Syria. They stopped just 40 kilometers from the Syrian capital, Damascus. On the northern front, nearly 800 Israeli soldiers were killed and thousands were injured. Meanwhile, on the southern front, although the Egyptian army initially broke through the Sinai Peninsula defenses, a few days later, the Israeli Defense Forces continuously took the initiative, launching preemptive attacks. In this war, although Israel eventually stabilized the situation, the entire process was truly arduous. Despite not having the advantage in terms of forces and equipment, they managed to repel the full-scale attack with resilient fighting spirit and flexible tactics. Every battle cry and shout reflected their determination to defend their homeland. However, the immense losses also revealed the brutality of war. Behind it were countless broken families. This battle is a typical example of combat strength in military history, while also being a heartfelt call for peace, reminding everyone of the pain of war and the preciousness of peace. The above is the entire content of the film Valley of Tears. Do you think this film is good? Give it a score. How many points would you rate the film? Please leave a comment below to let us know. Thank you for watching our entire video. Goodbye and see you in the next videos.